Throughout history, royal families have constructed their power on a single, unshakable principle: perfection must be performed, and imperfection must be hidden. Every gesture rehearsed, every weakness concealed, every scandal buried, so deep it becomes legend rather than fact. But some secrets refuse to stay buried. In the twilight of Queen Victoria's reign, one name haunted the corridors of power with persistent, troubling frequency: Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, known simply as Eddie. He was born to be king, raised in palaces, educated by the empire's finest minds. Yet before he could ascend the throne, he would become entangled in one of Victorian England's most explosive scandals: a web of forbidden desire, criminal accusations, and royal intervention so brazen it would be whispered about for generations. And then, just when the storm seemed ready to break, he died, suddenly, conveniently, at 28 years old. This is the story of Prince Albert Victor, the lost heir, the scandal that nearly destroyed a dynasty, and the death that saved it. And if you're fascinated by the secrets history tried to bury, please like and subscribe for more untold stories from the past. On January 8, 1864, at Frogmore House in Windsor, Princess Alexandra of Denmark gave birth 2 months ahead of schedule to a son so small and frail that attending physicians privately doubted his survival. They baptized him quickly Albert Victor Christian Edward, hedging against the very real possibility that the infant prince might not live long enough for a proper ceremony. But he did survive, and in surviving, he created a problem no one had anticipated. He would never quite thrive. His parents were England's most glamorous couple. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, was charismatic, pleasure-seeking, and perpetually at odds with his formidable mother, Queen Victoria. Princess Alexandra was celebrated as one of the most beautiful women in Europe, beloved by the public for her grace and her stoic tolerance of her husband's notorious infidelities. Into this glittering, dysfunctional world came Eddie, a child who from the very beginning seemed to exist slightly out of step with everyone around him. Alexandra adored him with fierce, protective devotion. Perhaps she saw in her firstborn the same vulnerability she felt in a court that valued her appearance but largely ignored her opinions. Her progressive deafness, caused by childhood illness, made her seem distant, detached, living in a world slightly removed from the noise and chaos of royal life. Eddie seemed to inhabit that same quiet space. His father, by contrast, found the boy baffling and disappointing. The Prince of Wales had been raised under his own father's rigid discipline and had rebelled spectacularly. He expected his sons to possess the charm and vigor he'd cultivated in defiance of his parents. Eddie possessed neither. From early childhood, tutors noted troubling patterns. The boy was affectionate, yes, gentle with animals, kind to servants. But he was also alarmingly slow to speak, struggled to focus on lessons, and seemed to retreat into daydreams rather than engage with the world around him. One tutor wrote in frustrated assessment, "The prince's mind appears dormant to an abnormal degree. He requires constant supervision and the presence of his brother merely to complete the simplest tasks." His younger brother George, born just 17 months after Eddie, became both companion and implicit rebuke. George was sharper, quicker, more disciplined. Where Eddie drifted, George focused. Where Eddie charmed without trying, George worked methodically to earn approval. The contrast was noted by everyone, discussed by no one. Queen Victoria, watching from Windsor, grew increasingly alarmed. In letters to her daughter, she fretted openly about Eddie's future. The boy must be made to work. He cannot be allowed to drift through life as an ornament. The empire requires strength, not softness. But softness was precisely what Eddie possessed in abundance. He loved music, preferred drawing to drilling, showed more interest in fashion than in statecraft. These qualities might have been charming in a younger son. In the heir presumptive to the throne, second in line after his father, they were deeply concerning. By the time Eddie reached adolescence, palace officials had begun carefully discussing what no one wanted to say aloud. This prince might never be suitable for kingship. Something would have to be done. In September 1877, 13-year-old Prince Albert Victor and 12-year-old Prince George were sent to join the Royal Navy training program aboard HMS Britannia, a decommissioned ship anchored off Dartmouth that served as a floating academy for future officers. For Eddie, it was presented as an opportunity, a chance to develop discipline, build character, experience the world beyond palace walls. In reality, it was a desperate intervention. Perhaps the rigid structure of military life could forge this gentle, distracted boy into something resembling a future king. The brothers lived in surprisingly Spartan conditions compared to their upbringing. They shared quarters, drilled alongside sons of naval officers and country gentry, and were expected to follow the same schedules as every other cadet. No special treatment, the orders read, though of course everyone knew exactly who they were. Eddie hated the discipline, but loved the freedom. For the first time in his life, he wasn't constantly watched by tutors, analyzing his every hesitation. He could wander, observe, befriend boys who treated him as Eddie rather than Your Royal Highness. He discovered he had a talent for charming people, not through studied effort like his father, but through genuine warmth and interest in others. George, predictably, excelled. He took to naval routine with natural aptitude, earned respect from instructors, and seemed to find in military structure exactly what he'd needed. Eddie, just as predictably, struggled. He couldn't master navigation, grew seasick easily, and showed far more interest in sketching the exotic ports they visited than in understanding the strategic importance of Britain's naval presence there. In 1879, the brothers were assigned to HMS Britannia for a 3-year voyage that would take them around the globe. It was an extraordinary journey, through the Mediterranean, to the West Indies, around South Africa, across the Indian Ocean to Australia and the Far East, then finally home via the Suez Canal. In Japan, both princes were tattooed by renowned artists. Eddie chose a dragon design on his arm, a decision that scandalized Queen Victoria when she learned of it months later. In Gibraltar, they attended military exercises. In Australia, they were received as visiting dignitaries, the future of the empire made flesh. In Hong Kong and Singapore, they witnessed the machinery of British colonial power operating at its peak. Eddie sent letters home filled with observations about people, customs, music, and art. He sketched constantly, temples, landscapes, local dress. He collected souvenirs obsessively, silk robes, carved figures, musical instruments. George sent home reports on naval tactics, ship design, and imperial administration. He is happy only when permitted to wander freely, one accompanying officer wrote in his private diary. The prince collects impressions and objects rather than knowledge. He seems to observe the world as a spectator rather than a future sovereign who will be called upon to govern it. When they returned to England in August 1882, after nearly 3 years at sea, the palace declared the experiment an unqualified success. The press published glowing accounts of the worldly young princes who had circumnavigated the globe, representing British power and prestige to the far corners of the empire. But those who had sailed with them knew the truth was more complicated. George had discovered his calling. He would remain in the Navy, eventually commanding his own ship. Eddie had merely confirmed how profoundly lost he was. At 18 years old, he had seen the world, but still had no clear sense of his place in it. The brothers parted ways that autumn. George stayed at sea, building the naval career that would define him. Eddie was sent to Trinity College, Cambridge, to receive the university education expected of someone in his position. It was a decision that would haunt the royal family for generations. In October 1883, Prince Albert Victor arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, accompanied by an entourage that included his personal chaplain, Reverend John Neil Dalton, and the newly appointed tutor, named James Kenneth Stephen. Stephen was 24 years old, brilliant, eccentric, and already recognized as one of Cambridge's most promising young scholars. He came from impeccable background. His father was a distinguished judge. His cousin was Virginia Woolf. He wrote poetry, edited undergraduate journals, and possessed the kind of charismatic intellectualism that made him a natural mentor to privileged young men seeking guidance. Eddie, now 19, was placed in private rooms rather than student lodgings, a concession to his position that immediately set him apart. He was not expected to sit for exams or complete coursework in any rigorous sense. His presence at Cambridge was symbolic, meant to polish rather than educate. Stephen took his role as tutor seriously, perhaps too seriously. He spent hours with Eddie, guiding him through literature, history, and philosophy that the prince would never be tested on. They took long walks around the grounds, attended concerts together, dined privately in Stephen's rooms while discussing poetry and art. To contemporaries, it appeared to be devoted mentorship. But letters Stephen wrote during this period, later examined by historians, suggest something more intense. He described Eddie as possessing a beauty of spirit that surpasses his considerable physical grace. He wrote poems that seemed to reference a golden-haired prince whose gentle nature transcends the coarse demands of duty. Whether these feelings were reciprocated, whether anything physical occurred, remains unknown. But in Victorian England, even the suggestion of inappropriate intimacy between men was dangerous, and whispers began almost immediately. Eddie seemed oblivious to the scrutiny. He avoided lectures, attended social gatherings, hosted by dons known for their aesthetic sensibilities, and became friendly with Oscar Browning, a controversial figure who hosted salons featuring attractive undergraduate men discussing literature and philosophy over wine and cigars. There was nothing overtly scandalous about these gatherings, but they existed in a gray space that made palace officials nervous. Artistic, intellectual, predominantly male, and just subversive enough to attract attention from those who policed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. By his second year at Cambridge, Eddie had developed a reputation, not for academic achievement, but for charm, beauty, and a certain fascinating vagueness. One contemporary described him as a figure of ethereal detachment, as though he inhabited our world, but belonged to some other realm entirely. In June 1885, Eddie received his honorary degree from Cambridge, a formality that fooled no one. He had learned nothing substantial, contributed nothing to intellectual discourse, and left Cambridge exactly as he'd arrived, beautiful, aimless, and increasingly the subject of speculation. But he'd also made connections that would prove dangerous. James Kenneth Stephen would remain in Eddie's orbit for years, his devotion evolving into something that friends described as obsessive. And the artists, poets, and aesthetes Eddie had befriended at Cambridge existed at the edges of a world Victorian society was determined to keep hidden. The stage was set for scandal. Eddie simply didn't realize he was standing on it. By 1885, with Eddie now 21 years old and showing no signs of developing the gravitas expected of a future king, Queen Victoria decided a solution must be found: marriage. A suitable wife would provide stability, purpose, and most importantly, heirs to secure the succession. The search began with characteristic royal pragmatism. Eddie's bride would need to be Protestant, of royal or aristocratic blood, politically advantageous, and preferably possessed of the strong character Eddie so clearly lacked. The Queen and her advisers began compiling lists. Princess Alix of Hesse was proposed, beautiful, well-connected, and eventually destined to become the last Tsarina of Russia. Eddie met her at family gatherings, was clearly smitten with her beauty, but made no impression on her whatsoever. She politely but firmly declined any suggestion of an engagement. Princess Helene of Orleans was next. This match had considerable appeal. Helene was intelligent, elegant, and genuinely fond of Eddie, They spent time together during a family holiday in the French Alps in 1890, and to everyone's surprise, Eddie actually proposed. Helene accepted. For a brief moment, it seemed the problem had been solved. But there was one insurmountable obstacle. Helene was Catholic. The heir to the British throne could not marry a Catholic without triggering a constitutional crisis. Helene offered to convert to Anglicanism, but her father, the Comte de Paris, absolutely refused to permit it. The engagement collapsed. Eddie was genuinely heartbroken, perhaps the first time he'd felt strongly about anything. But his heartbreak was insufficient reason to append centuries of constitutional precedent. The search would continue. Throughout this period, Eddie was attached to various military regiments with purely ceremonial duties. He held the rank of major in the 10th Hussars, attended social functions, reviewed troops, and generally served as a decorative reminder of royal connection to the armed forces. He performed these duties adequately, but without distinction. One fellow officer recalled, he was unfailingly polite, generous with his time, and utterly uninterested in anything military. One had the sense he was perpetually acting a role written for someone else. The role was about to get far more difficult. In the summer of 1889, the Metropolitan Police received a tip about suspicious activity at 19 Cleveland Street in London's Fitzrovia neighborhood. What they uncovered would become one of the most explosive scandals of the Victorian era. The house operated as a male brothel, a Molly house, in the slang of the time, run by Charles Hammond, who provided young men, primarily telegraph boys and other working-class youths, to wealthy clients willing to pay handsomely for discretion. The revelation alone was scandalous enough. But as police investigated and arrested some of the young men involved, names began to emerge. Lord Arthur Somerset, equerry to the Prince of Wales, Eddie's father, was directly implicated. When questioned, Somerset's solicitor made veiled threats that if prosecuted, his client might be forced to name persons of even greater distinction. The code was transparent to anyone familiar with royal circles. The person being protected was Prince Albert Victor. The evidence linking Eddie directly to Cleveland Street was circumstantial at best. No witness placed him at the address. No letters were found. But rumors spread with devastating speed. The prince had been seen entering the house in disguise. He'd been a client of Hammond's establishment. Powerful men were orchestrating a cover-up to protect the heir to the throne from criminal prosecution. Behind closed doors, panic seized the royal household. The Prince of Wales personally intervened, meeting with government officials and newspaper editors. The message was clear. This story must not reach the public in any form that implicated his son. The police investigation suddenly stalled. Key witnesses disappeared. Some fled to the continent with suspicious amounts of cash, suggesting they'd been paid to leave. Lord Arthur Somerset escaped to France before he could be arrested, living the rest of his life in comfortable exile. Charles Hammond, the brothel keeper, was allowed to vanish entirely. The prosecution of the few remaining defendants was handled so delicately that observers in the courtroom noted the obvious. Important details were being deliberately omitted. When radical journalist Ernest Park published an article in the North London press directly accusing the highest in the land of involvement, he was sued for criminal libel. At trial, Park attempted to present evidence of royal connections, but was blocked at every turn. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. The message was clear. Even suggesting royal involvement was criminal. But suppressing the story in British newspapers didn't suppress the truth. European and American papers reported freely on the scandal, describing it as evidence of rot at the heart of the British establishment. In Paris, Brussels, and New York, readers learned details that British citizens were forbidden to know about their own prince. Eddie himself was sent on an extended tour of India in late 1889, officially a diplomatic mission, but clearly a strategic exile. He needed to be out of England while the scandal died down, far from journalists and investigators. The tour lasted 7 months. Eddie traveled through Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, and dozens of smaller cities, attending receptions, tiger hunts, and elaborate ceremonies staged by Maharajas eager to display loyalty to the empire. He wrote letters home describing the overwhelming heat, the spectacular architecture, the exhausting schedule of official functions. He never mentioned Cleveland Street. Neither did anyone in his family, at least not in writing. When he returned to England in May 1890, the scandal had faded from immediate public attention. But it hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, transforming from current scandal into permanent whisper. For the rest of his life, Eddie would be dogged by insinuation he could never directly address. The royal family's strategy was now clear. Marry Eddie off as quickly as possible. A wife and family would rehabilitate his image, provide stability, and most importantly, produce heirs who would eventually push Eddie himself further from the throne. By late 1891, palace officials had identified the ideal candidate, Princess Mary of Teck, known to family as May. She was 24 years old, sensible, dignified, and most appealingly, possessed of no romantic illusions about marriage. She understood that royal unions were dynastic arrangements, not love stories. May came from complicated background. Her father was the Duke of Teck, a minor German royal with no money. Her mother was Queen Victoria's first cousin, which provided impeccable bloodlines but no fortune. The family lived in genteel near poverty, accepting grace and favor apartments and relying on royal relatives for financial support. For May, marriage to Eddie would solve all her family's problems. For Eddie, May represented the kind of steady, managing personality he'd always lacked. She could organize his life, handle correspondence, manage staff, and perform the duties of princess consort that he found so exhausting. They were introduced at a family gathering in autumn 1891. Eddie found her pleasant, if not exciting. May found him adequate, not inspiring certainly, but kind and unlikely to make excessive demands. Negotiations proceeded with businesslike efficiency. By December 1891, an engagement seemed imminent. The announcement would be made at Christmas, giving the country something cheerful to celebrate, and the royal family a chance to move past scandal toward stability. Eddie seemed resigned to his fate, perhaps even relieved. Marriage would provide structure, end the speculation about his character, and satisfy the family pressure that had pursued him since childhood. But on December 27, 1891, Eddie traveled to Sandringham House in Norfolk for the Christmas gathering where his engagement would be announced. He was meant to propose to May on January 7th, the day before his 28th birthday, during a house party organized specifically for that purpose. He would never make it to that day. The first symptoms appeared on January 7, 1892, the day Eddie had planned to propose to May. He complained of a headache, fatigue, and aching in his limbs. Nothing unusual for winter in a drafty English country house. He rested, took some tea, and insisted he'd be fine by evening. By the next morning, his 28th birthday, he was worse. Fever, severe congestion, difficulty breathing. The doctor diagnosed influenza, a common enough illness, though dangerous in an era before antibiotics. The diagnosis was refined within days. Influenza complicated by pneumonia. Eddie's condition deteriorated rapidly. His fever spiked dangerously high. He became delirious, calling out for people who weren't there, thrashing in bed, sometimes not recognizing family members at his bedside. Princess Alexandra never left his side. She held his hand, read to him during his lucid moments, and refused all suggestions that she rest. The Prince of Wales paced the corridors, sent dozens of telegrams, and consulted with London specialists who could do nothing more than the country doctor already at Eddie's bedside. May, the woman Eddie had been about to marry, sat vigil with the family, her role already shifting from future fiancée to mourner. On January 13th, 1892, Eddie seemed briefly to rally. His fever dropped slightly, his breathing eased. Doctors cautiously suggested he might recover. But that night, his condition collapsed. The pneumonia had spread too far. His lungs were drowning in fluid his body couldn't clear. At 9:35 a.m. on January 14, 1892, 6 days after his 28th birthday, Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward died at Sandringham House. His mother was holding his hand. His last word, according to some accounts, was "Mama." The nation went into mourning. Flags flew at half-mast. Black crepe draped public buildings. Newspapers published elaborate retrospectives celebrating Eddie's life, carefully edited versions that emphasized his charm, his travels, his devotion to duty. The Cleveland Street scandal was never mentioned. The rumors about his character were never acknowledged. In death, Eddie became the prince the family had always wanted him to be: noble, promising, tragically taken before his potential could be fulfilled. His funeral on January 20th, 1892, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, drew royalty from across Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany attended, as did representatives from every royal house on the continent. The service was magnificent, carefully staged to demonstrate both grief and continuity. And then something extraordinary happened. George, Eddie's younger brother, became the new heir to the throne. George, who'd always been the spare, the afterthought, was now second in line to become king. Everything changed for him in an instant. Even more remarkably, George was encouraged, strongly encouraged, to court Princess May of Teck. She'd been perfect for Eddie. She'd be perfect for George. Within 18 months of Eddie's death, George and May were married. She would eventually become Queen Mary, one of the most formidable consorts in British history. It was all so tidy. Almost too tidy. Did Prince Albert Victor die of influenza complicated by pneumonia? Almost certainly yes. Medical records, multiple witnesses, and the testimony of attending physicians all confirm it. But the timing, so convenient, so perfect, has fueled speculation for over a century. Eddie dies just days before an engagement that would have locked him irrevocably into the succession. He dies just 2 years after a scandal that nearly destroyed the monarchy's reputation. He dies, and suddenly all the problems he represented simply disappear. George becomes the heir and proves to be everything Eddie wasn't: disciplined, focused, dignified. May becomes George's wife and proves to be the perfect royal consort. The monarchy emerges from the potential crisis stronger than before. Some historians have suggested, carefully, with heavy caveats, that Eddie's illness might not have been entirely natural. The royal physician's notes are suspiciously vague in places. Some symptoms described don't quite fit textbook influenza. And the palace's response, moving immediately to arrange George's marriage to May, seems almost rehearsed. Other theories are darker still. Some claim Eddie didn't die at all, but was institutionalized in secret, hidden away in an asylum for the rest of his life, because his behavior or inclinations made him unsuitable for kingship. These theories lack evidence, but persist because they satisfy a narrative hunger. Surely there must be more to the story. Surely history can't be this simple. The truth, most likely, is simpler and sadder. Eddie was a gentle, confused young man born into a role he was never equipped to fulfill. He was educated, disciplined, shipped around the world, and pressured to become someone he fundamentally wasn't. And when scandal threatened to expose what palace officials suspected, that he was unsuitable for kingship, fate intervened in the form of a common illness. He died. The monarchy survived. Life continued. Today, Prince Albert Victor is barely remembered. He appears in history books as a footnote, mentioned primarily because his death changed the line of succession. Most people know George V, Eddie's brother, who became king. Fewer know that George only became king because his older brother died young. The Cleveland Street scandal is better remembered than Eddie himself, and even then, most accounts mention him only in passing, if at all. The rumors about his character have been examined by historians, debated, contextualized, but never definitively proven or disproven. What we're left with is a portrait of a young man trapped between impossible expectations and his own nature, whatever that nature actually was. He was charming but unfocused, kind but weak, well-meaning but ineffectual. He collected beautiful things and interesting people, preferred art to politics, and fundamentally lacked the hardness required of Victorian royalty. He might have been gay or bisexual, or simply someone whose gentle temperament was misread by a society determined to see masculinity in only the narrowest terms. He might have been learning disabled, or merely unconventional in how his mind worked. He might have been the victim of a scandal that had nothing to do with him, swept up in something he never understood. Or he might have been exactly what the whisper suggested, a man whose private life was fundamentally incompatible with public duty, who would have been exposed and destroyed if he'd lived long enough to become king. We'll never know for certain. The royal family made sure of that. What we do know is that Albert Victor Christian Edward, Prince of the United Kingdom, died at 28 years old, mourned publicly and privately forgotten. He was replaced, smoothly and efficiently, by a brother who proved capable of everything Eddie wasn't. And in that replacement lies perhaps the most telling detail of all. No one really missed him. The monarchy didn't falter. The succession didn't suffer. Within months, it was as though Eddie had never existed at all, just another portrait in a palace gallery, another name in the genealogical records, another what if that history casually discarded on its way to more important matters. He was born to be king. He died a prince. And in dying young, he perhaps achieved the only thing he ever could have. He spared his family the embarrassment of what his reign might have revealed, and spared himself the crushing weight of a crown he never wanted and could never have carried. Perhaps in the end, that was mercy. For him, and for the institution that survived him.